So before we get started, I want to acknowledge that here at Mohi, we are gathering on the historic and contemporary lands of the Duwamish, Suquamish, and all Coast Salish people. We acknowledge the forced displacement of Native communities from this land, while honoring the endurance of the Duwamish people who still live here. To this day, the Duwamish people have yet to receive federal recognition. We encourage you to visit the Duwamish Longhouse and Cultural Center in West Seattle if you're local, or you can check out their website to learn more. At Mohi, understanding our past connects us to the present, and we are fully committed to exploring the complexity of history. Now tonight, David is going to tell us a little bit about the complexity of our maritime highway and our local waterways. And I'm so honored to introduce David. I've had the great privilege of working with him for the past few years. He is a wonderful presenter and the author of award-winning book, Too High and Too Steep, Reshaping Seattle's Topography and Seattle Walks, Discovering History and Nature in the City. In fact, I think David has just started offering virtual Seattle walks, so that'll be something to check out. He's also a curatorial associate at the Burke Museum, and his next book will be Home Waters, Human and Natural History in Puget Sound. So let's give David a big virtual welcoming round of applause.
Exciting. Thank you. Good evening and welcome to this Virtual History Cafe. I was lucky as a child to grow up just a few miles from the original Mohi location down in Montlake. And I have these great memories as a kid of going there and looking at the periscope. You could spin it around and spy on people, and walking down the the hallways there where you had the wood sidewalks. What was Seattle like in the 1880s, 1890s? And I like to think that that helped push me down a career thinking about history and having a connection to place. So it is an incredible honor and an incredible pleasure to be here tonight and to be part of the community of Mohi, something that's really been part of my life for almost 50 years now. I'd like to thank Mohi for asking me, and I'd like to thank Rachel and Nicole for helping set up this program, dealing with the logistics, the technical issues. As they said, this is a new endeavor. We're all in it together, something new and exciting. So I think it'll be interesting to see how it goes. I'm excited about it. And I'd like to thank all of you for Zooming in, for joining us from, sounds like, around the country, which is just wonderful. And in particular, for being part of the Mohi community. And I think in this time that we live in, that coming together as a community, sharing new experiences, learning from each other, reaching out to each other is one of the ways we're going to make it through this pandemic. So I'm, as I said, very honored that all of you are here joining me and Mohi tonight. And I sincerely hope that all of you are safe and well. Before I sort of get going a little bit more on the talk, I just want to say I'm really excited about this. I've been thinking about this for a while. I've been thinking about this new way to share information, this new way to reach out and strengthen the communities. And this is a word I will continuously use throughout, this idea of community and connection and relationship, because I think that's the way we can come together and address this situation we're in. And it's also one of the things that's amazing about Mohi is that they recognize the past, the present, and the future, and are always trying to weave them together to better understand the stories of Seattle and how they are impacting us on a regular basis. And in being part of the community, there's two other ways I think that we can all be involved. One, I will make a push to encourage you to become members of Mohi. It is an amazing organization, and if you've never been to the museum when it opens again, it's well worth going. I think it's one of my favorite places in the city. And the second one is something that for those of you who know me will probably find it amazing that I'm going to say this. I'm encouraging everyone to live tweet. It's not my normal thing, but I figure this is live. There's some pretty pictures. You're welcome to do screenshots. It's electronic. And if you do it, I think it would be great if you want to include either my handle or Mohi's handle. It'd be sort of fun. As I said, I grew up in Seattle, just a few miles from Mohi, and for the last 20 years, as Nicole said, I have been a writer. And what I've been looking at, most importantly to me, is the relationship between people and place. How do we impact the landscape, and how does the landscape impact us? It's a two-way street, and it's that relationship that I think has forged the story of Seattle. And it's one of the things that I've told in several books, whether Too High and Too Steep, looking at these big engineering projects, the filling in of the Duwamish tide flats where the king domes are. And in fact, oh, it's gone. I used to have a king dome pin on here. Oh, well. It's about the ship canal, and about probably the most audacious thing that Seattle ever did, which was the regrade of Denny Hill. And then I was lucky enough to work with my friend Jen Ott on Waterway, which takes that story of the locks, adds beautiful photos, pictures, and Jen's great text together to tell the story. And then finally, Seattle Walks. This is my most recent book. And to me, this book, which weaves together 17 walks, is, I don't mean to sound self-promotional, but to me, what I think is important about this book is my goal of getting people to connect to place, to slow down and be more observant. And we live in this world where, for many of us, our world has been constricted. I don't think I've been more than 10 miles from my house in the last 6 weeks, and I've been walking around the neighborhood. And one of the goals with Seattle Walks was to get people out and to discover their neighborhood and their neighbors, whether those neighbors are people or plants or animals. And that, to me, is a critical way to address and think about our relationship to place. And as Nicole said, I'm at present working on a book about natural history in Puget Sound and human history called Home Waters. Like Seattle Walks and Too High and Too Steep, it will be published by the University of Washington Press. And I think right now we are at a critical moment in the story of Puget Sound. The waterway, despite what some people might think, is actually in better shape than it's been for many decades. We've done a good job of trying to clean it up. We're putting fewer pollutants in. Yes, we still have problems, but we're on a path, I think, that can take us to a more sustainable and better stewardship. And the question is, do we go down that path? Do we make the efforts necessary to protect, defend, and sustain this waterway for us and for all the species that live there, or do we fall back? And in Home Waters, that was really this book is that's what's driving me, is to try and understand that story a little bit better and give people ways to think about that past and how it's affected the present. Just if you are interested, I generally post information on my website, and then I also use Twitter as my main social media for sharing information on that. So if you're interested in following me on that, that's a way to keep track of what I'm doing with books and talks and walks. And again, as Nicole said, please submit questions. I love questions, and I will be attempting to answer them at the end, or at least making up answers to them. So Puget Sound, what is Puget Sound? That was the first question I asked when I started to work on this book, was trying to understand what makes up this waterway. This is put out by Puget Sound Partnership, and this is probably the greatest physical extent of the waterway. It shows the entire watershed of the Puget Sound waterway. So any water, any precipitation that falls within this area will eventually end up in Puget Sound. And it's a critical way to think about the place, because it really makes it clear that what we do on the land is critically important to what happens in the water, whether we're dumping pharmaceuticals, peeing coffee, or whatever issue it might be. We are contributing to it, and we are part of Puget Sound no matter how we look. And this is in fact the official definition by the state. It extends up to the Canada border, all the way out to the Strait, to Cape Flattery. This is Puget Sound. For me, I take a little bit narrower view. I look at what I call Puget Sound proper, south of Admiralty Inlet, this little narrow entrance into this waterway down here, this protected waterway of the Sound. So Hood Canal, south, and then around here. All of these areas, the Strait, Puget Sound, and then the Strait of Georgia, is what in recent years has become known as the Salish Sea. And it's a very important way to visualize and to think about and to consider this landscape, But for me, I wanted to take a little bit tighter view, even though in the book, stories I write cross out of this past Admiralty Inlet into the San Juans, because animals don't do it, weather doesn't do it. We've all gone through this area. But Admiralty Inlet is really the area south of that. And in thinking about this waterway and looking at its history, the earliest name we have for it is from the Coast Salish people who lived here. The idea, they called it Walge in the, I will mispronounce it because that's what I always do in the Lushootseed language, and it means salt water. And the idea of it is that it's more of a concept than a geographical definition as we think of this as a map definition. And it was for the people who lived here that it was this idea that we are of the Walge, we are of the salt water, we are part of this place. This is how we connect to the landscape here. And in fact, an early ethnographer in the area was doing work, and he found that the people who lived along the salt water here, they considered the people who lived up the watersheds on the streams not as high class, as sort of not as well bred. And in fact, there's an early insult from that time that this person came across that if you wanted to put someone down, you would describe them as being like that person from up in Issaquah. So no offense to Issaquanians or Issaquites, however you call yourselves, but back in the day, I guess they didn't think as highly of you as maybe they should. But oh well, so that is Puget Sound, and this is really going to be the focus of the story. And that name Walge began to change in May of 1792. When George Vancouver became the first European to sail down what they thought was the supposed Strait of Juan de Fuca down through here and take that right turn into what he labeled Admiralty Inlet. And for Vancouver, in May of 1792, he thought of Admiralty Inlet as this most of the waterway running down here. On May 20th, they were anchored off of Bainbridge Island, and a spot that he called Restoration Point. And on that day, he sent his lieutenant, Peter Puget, south in two small boats with about 10 men or so to explore the waterway down to the south here. Puget arrives back, and on May 29th, George Vancouver writes in his journal, to honor his exertions, I name it Puget's Sound. And that was the beginning of that name. And it specifically referred to the area just to the south. It wasn't up here, it was basically south of what we think of as at least Seattle, and perhaps south of Tacoma was the area that was Puget Sound. And obviously over time, it has grown, now including the mountains, the waterway, all the way out into this area. So the landscape has changed, or our vision of the landscape has changed, which is pretty consistent. Places always have that action. This is one of my favorite paintings of it, from Albert Bierstadt's painting of Puget Sound and Mount Rainier. And what I love about this is that he conveys the idea of the sound, that you have this amazing mountain dominating it, you have this forest, and you have the water. And yet, central to that was you could not include this landscape without putting a canoe in it. The canoe really, for thousands of years, was one of the defining characteristics of this waterway. We don't know how long people have been using canoes. Our earliest evidence for people in the Puget Lowland comes from an archaeological site in Redmond that dates back to about 12,500, 13,000 years ago. We can assume that they probably were moving by water through here, but we don't know. We have no physical evidence of it. And furthermore, we know that it's not until about 5,000 years ago that the climate in this area got to a point that allowed what is basically the modern forest to come in, the holy trinity, if you will, of Douglas fir, western hemlock, and western red cedar. And in particular, that final member of the trinity, western red cedar, was key because that was and is the material for making canoes. So we can assume probably by about 5,000 years ago, people were starting to use canoes in this area with, now that they had the wood necessary, we also start to find archaeological evidence in terms of woodworking tools about 5,000 years ago. So canoes were central to the people of this region. We don't know exactly what they look like because the oldest evidence of canoes is only a few hundred years ago. But again, early ethnographic work in the area found that there were a variety of different canoes. And if you think about Puget Sound, it's really sort of an unusual waterway in the sense that if you compare it with areas of navigation, say on the East Coast, it's very different. On the East Coast, you've got nasty things like snow, it's hot, there are bugs, there are hurricanes. We don't have that in Puget Sound. We generally have pretty benign weather. Probably our biggest weather problem is fog. Yeah, rain's a little bit of a deal, but you get used to that. The big challenge in terms of navigating Puget Sound would be the tides and the currents, which can create havoc and change constantly in this area, whether you have an ebb tide or a flood tide moving in or out of the landscape. So over time, the people of the area, the Coast Salish people, certainly adapted and found different canoes that worked. The war canoe, which is the one that was in the Bierstadt painting, this is actually probably more of a northern canoe, one that you would find more out on the coast, bigger water, very different manageability than something like what were the primary Puget Sound canoes in Puget Sound proper. That would be the freight canoe and the trolling canoe. Each one had its own purpose for moving through the waterway, whether they're ferrying goods or used for out for hunting fish. So those were the two main ones on the saltwater. What's interesting is those Issaquanians, or Issaquites, they had a different canoe. They had a shovel nose canoe. And despite the put down, this was also a beautifully adapted canoe because it was designed and had been to work on the fresh water on the rivers of the area, that someone could stand in the front and spear fish while someone was in the back. So each one of these had been adapted and evolved over time to fit the landscape, to deal with the waves, the wind, the tides, the currents of here. And so you could move through it. And they were each one beautifully designed, beautifully adapted for this area. And this was the culture for thousands of years in this area. That is how people moved through here. But over time, and particularly once you got into the 20th century, a change occurred, understandably, as new technology moved in, which I will address in just a minute. The canoe culture starts to fade a bit amongst the native people of this area until about 1989. And at that time, at the centennial of Washington State, a group of elders from throughout the region gathered together and decided that they wanted to revive canoe culture. And they worked with the U.S. Forest Service, who provided some beautiful old growth Western red cedar trees, worked with the state to promote this, and they gathered at Suquamish on the west side of Puget Sound, 25 tribes or so, 30 different canoes, paddled across to Golden Gardens and had a celebration, and it was called the Paddle to Seattle. And over time, that Paddle to Seattle has evolved into what's now known as the canoe journey. And this is widespread throughout the Salish Sea. Each year, a tribe or a First Nations will host it. This one was, I'm at Alki, or Alki as it was originally called. This area was part of the canoe journey that was going to end up down at Puyallup. And it was incredible to see the day I was there as dozens and dozens of boats of canoes come paddling in, and each time someone, the tribe or the First Nation paddled in, the person on land from the Puyallup tribe would say, "Welcome, come to our land. We look forward to sharing stories, to sharing food with you." And you just had this sense of pride, of connection to place that just, it was really palpable amongst the community there, and just wonderful to see as people joined together to help in a community, to gather together and work together to address the issues of the day. And I talked to someone from the Muckleshoot tribe, and he said, as he's gotten involved with the canoe journey, what he's realized is this deeper connection to the story, to his family, to his ancestors, to this place. He said, I hadn't really understood the tides. I hadn't understood the currents, but now being out on these canoes, I've gathered this, I've learned this, and strengthen this relationship. And it was a magical, magical moment. And if you ever have a chance to see the canoe journey, participate in any way, I highly recommend it. It really gives a picture of what this area must have looked like for thousands of years, with canoe after canoe coming on shore and people sharing stories and getting to know each other. It's just a very powerful moment. And all of that began to change in 1835 with the arrival of this boat, the steamer Beaver. It had been built on the Thames River and paid for by the Hudson's Bay Company. And it had been outfitted as a steamer initially, and then they put sails on it. They sailed the Beaver from London around the Cape of Good Horn to Hawaii to Fort Vancouver on the Columbia River, where people on the HPC fort down there took off the sails and left it into a steamer. It then steams up into Puget Sound, and in 1834-35 becomes the first steamship in the area. And you can imagine it must have been pretty amazing to see. It was here for the next several decades. And during that time, it basically was a general store plying up and down the Sound. It had one big problem. It lived up to its name in the sense that it went through wood like crazy. They would have to stop. Basically, it took 6 axemen 2 days, cutting for 12 to 14 hours to provide enough wood to cover about 230 miles. So they'd steam, they'd stop, they'd cut, they'd load, they'd steam, they'd cut, they'd stop, they'd load. It was not really that great. It eventually gets converted to coal. And it was here for decades. It eventually crashes and sinks in what's now Stanley Park on Burrid Inlet. But this really opened up the opportunity, or gave people the idea that, wow, we don't have to rely on the wind. We don't have to rely on human power. We can rely on an engine to travel through the waterway. There was just one problem with the Beaver, and that primary problem was that it was British. And this had become American territory. In 1846, Washington separates from Oregon, becomes its own, or Washington and Oregon become part of America, separate from England. And in 1853, Washington becomes its own territory. And in that year, the first American steamer arrived. It was called the Ferry. It was described as undersized and cranky. I won't go there because you can imagine what else that people that get described by that way. But it opened up, it showed people what was potential. And its primary purpose was carrying people from Olympia up to Steilacoom and to Alki and Seattle. In 1853, Alki or Alki and Seattle were still considered to be separate towns. $5 to go from Olympia up to Steilacoom, $10 to Alki and Seattle. To put that in perspective, in that time period, an average worker might make $2 or $3 a day. So if you can imagine twice your salary or 3 times your salary to take a boat from Olympia to Seattle, maybe not the best way to go. And it didn't last long. Like many vessels, it ends up blowing up in 1857. And so it was not a long-lived. But again, it's the potential. It's a way that the community realizes this is how we can travel. And you get the development of what's known as the famous mosquito fleet in this region. And this is the fleet, or armada of steamship after steamer after steamship coming into this area. I've seen numbers from anywhere from 700 to 2,500 different named vessels. I lean towards the 700 number, but they came in all shapes and sizes. And this really becomes the sinew that binds together the entire Puget Sound region. Before going on, mosquito, I just want to address the word or the phrase mosquito fleet. It's long associated with Puget Sound, but interestingly enough, it was the first reference I can find is from the Revolutionary War, describing vessels on the Hudson River, always to describe fairly small, quick little vessels. You see it with the War of 1812, Pirates in the Caribbean, the Civil War, but roughly about 1890 is when the term shows up here to refer retroactively to all of these vessels that are in this area. And they came in every shape and size. I like to sort of compare the description of a mosquito fleet vessel to Judge Potter's description of pornography, you know it when you see it. And these are clearly all mosquito fleet vessels. Generally, they had, like the Hayak, a pointy end, so they're often called pointy enders. Most are made from wood. Most were propeller driven, like the steamer up here, or the flyer, but some also were paddle wheelers, both side and rear paddle wheelers. They were all flat bottomed. My favorite description comes from the novelist Archie Bynne, who described one called The Old Settler this way: a bastard creation, a common scow with a donkey engine which had been induced on board under false pretense and then persuaded to turn a pair of homemade paddle wheels. The Old Settler did great, though like many of the other ones, it eventually sank underneath the Seattle pier, and they then brought the engine up and used it for a printing press. But what united them was where they went. And that, as I said, is everywhere in Puget Sound. This obviously from 1908. These are just the routes coming primarily from the Seattle area, going up to Bellingham, up to Blaine, out to the San Juan Islands, out to the Strait of Juan de Fuca, over to the west side. Some would go up into the lakes, some would go up into the rivers. They went everywhere they could. And in essence, what they were was the lifeline for people in this region. It was sort of a post office, a bank, a transit center, a UPS system, a general store, and probably also a really good way to get gossip. You can imagine as these vessels are going up and down, the captains have all sorts of great information. And I think we still see remnants of it. I've noticed as when I was working on this book and over the years as I've gone around Puget Sound, you'll sometimes see what looks like abandoned piers going out into the waterway where it's just the little pilings. I'm like, God, what is that? And my theory is that many of those places are locations of former stops for mosquito fleet vessels, because all it took was a dock and people could pull up, and even that wasn't necessary. You could pull up to a little landing, you could pull up practically on the shore, people would row out into rowboats. This is a list I put together of places where mosquito fleet vessels stopped. It's around 350, and I know I didn't have all of the names on it, but it was this central to Puget Sound that you could live anywhere on the Sound, back up some little side channel, you could be in a little harbor, you could be a few hundred yards off, but you still could connect to place. You could still connect to the larger areas through these vessels. It was, as I said, it was this sinew pulling together the entire Sound, and it was central. It was like the canoes, but on a multiplied out as more and more people show up into this area and have a different way to interact with the landscape. But like all good things, it must come to an end. We start to see a change in the mosquito fleet. I love this sort of list. This is put together by the late historian Joe Barr. Fire, collision, sunk by crew. I can imagine there's probably more than one that was sunk by a crew. So basically the fleet dies over time. But the driver is, as you might imagine, you can easily imagine, I think, is the automobile. And with the growth of the automobile, roads become more essential for people moving through the Sound, that they find that that's a better way. They have more control over it. Interesting, you get the development of the ferry system, which I'm going to come back to in a second, but I want to point out a couple ferries. One is the Bailey Gatzert. This was an old steamer that was converted to have automobiles. They could put them on the front end. There's a little lift that was built that could drop the car onto the front end and then lift it off at the next spot. The Elk, sort of one of the earliest ferries that we think of as a car-style ferry, where you drive in one end and drive out the other. But the one I want to point out in particular is the City of Seattle. And this was the first ferry designed that you could drive a vehicle on, and in particular, that vehicle would have been a horse and buggy. This started going on December 31st in 1888. And I wonder if it may come back because its primary run was from downtown Seattle over to Admiralty Head to West Seattle. And I know we've got a little bit of an issue with bridges there, but we had the ferry. And what's interesting is it started out, it was 40 cents a ride to ride the ferry, but there was another vessel started operating privately on that route, going back and forth, and with the price for it eventually got down to a nickel per ride. For those of you who are nostalgia bound, the city of Seattle, that vessel which started running in 1888 still exists. All you have to do is go down to Sausalito, and there's a little Airbnb called the Yellow Ferry, I think is what it's called. And last I looked, it was something like almost $400 a night to stay in it when we are able to go back and do that. But this idea that ferries start to take over because of the law, because of the road system. And as far as I've been able to tell, there are just 2 Mosquito Fleet vessels left in the area. The Virginia 5, if we were at Mohi and in their cafe, we could just look out behind us, and there the Virginia 5 would be. It was built in 1922, primarily to run the Colvos Passage on the other side of Vashon Island, and a classic Mosquito Fleet, pointy ender, wood, flat bottom. Beautiful, beautiful boat. Fortunately, it was purchased by a group of steamer aficionados. They've upgraded it, they've restored it. It's on the National Register of Historic Places. And hopefully this summer, it will be something that all of us can ride again. It is quite an amazing vessel. My favorite, though, is the Carlisle 2. This is, again, a classic Mosquito Fleet vessel, wood, flat, pointy-ended. And this one is 5 years older. And it has basically been making the same run since it was built for over a century between Bremerton and Port Orchard. And you can still ride it to this day. It's a $2 ride to ride back and forth across Sinclair Inlet. And it, to me, really illustrates aspects of the Mosquito Fleet in the sense that it is a community building vessel. The days that I've ridden it, particularly in the afternoon, it seems like most of the people on the boat are workers at the naval facility there, and they take that across back to Port Orchard. They don't have to drive around. It's guaranteed. It's always going to go. There's no traffic jams, but it allows them to live where they want and yet still have this connection to the larger community. So to me, it really exemplifies it. If you've never been, when the world opens up again, I encourage you to go over there. But the big change was with the automobile led to a substantive change in the Mosquito Fleet, the elimination of it, but it also made a change from how the ownership worked. Before, when the Mosquito Fleet operated, basically most of the vessels were privately owned, privately built, and that's why you get all this sort of weird shapes. But with the ferry system, you need to have much larger vessels, and that means more capital. That ends up leading to the Puget Sound Navigation Company, their Blackball line, and the Kalakala, and it really becomes it becomes the dominant system. It takes over the entire ferry system. And I just want to play. There's a little song associated with it, and I just want to play this, if I may.
On the Blackball ferry line up in Seattle, where the sunshine seldom shines, up in Seattle, all the whistles go, and the bells go, and the ferry boats are chugging right along, right along. All the people love to ride the blue Pacific on the Blackball ferry line, to be specific, while the whistles go, and the bells go, and the ferry boats are chugging right along. Right along. Up on the upper deck, the view is great by heck. You love your Galatex and you're in cover. And when the whistles blow, you hate to go below, 'cause that's the signal that the fun is nearly over. On the Blackball ferry line up in Seattle, every single GOP and Democrat will hear those whistles go, and the bells go, as the ferry boats are chugging right along.
So if you didn't figure that one out, that was Bing Crosby singing that. And what's fascinating is that his, I think, grandfather was an early operator in the Mosquito Fleet. So deep connection for him. So the Blackball takes over, and then through a variety of politics and battles, eventually the state takes over the system in 1951, and we get the development of the Washington State Ferry line system at that time. Interestingly, in 1950, we also have a proposal. Those of you who live in Seattle know that we like to put out these audacious proposals for transportation system, whether it was the early 1900s, the Bogue Plan, forward thrust. This one may be the nuttiest of them all. This involved a floating bridge from Fauntleroy over to Vashon. It would have been about 14,000 feet long, which is twice the length of the I-90 bridge, which had been built 10 years earlier in 1940. But in addition, as you can see, there are two proposed tubes, one between West Seattle and Restoration Point, and one between West Point and over to Bainbridge Island, rough over here. And each of these would have been a 3-foot thick walls tube submerged 50 feet beneath the surface and held to the bottom by cables. I'm sure it would have been quite safe and fun. This one up here would have been almost 21,000 feet long. I think it was two tubes and a little floating island out here that somehow they were going to do it. Those of you who are from Seattle are well aware that this has never been built. In fact, no one has ever built a tube like system like this anywhere in the world. But you know, Seattle, we love to dream. We love to come up with great ideas for transportation system and then do nothing about them. So in 1951, we get the ferry system, but there are more ferries than that. And being the sort of dork that I am, I decided that I wanted to try and ride all the ferries in the Puget Sound area, in greater Puget Sound area. And so we're of course familiar with the WashDOT ferries, the ones that go, the ones in red here, these 10 different routes that go out there, but then there are a bunch of other ones. And I define a ferry as a regularly scheduled route. So charters don't work, but it needs to be regularly scheduled. So you have the Bremerton one, you have the fast boat that goes over to Bremerton from Seattle, and then you have between Bremerton and Port Orchard and Bremerton and Annapolis, a little town just near Port Orchard. That rides, you get the Admiral Pete, really lovely little system. Down in Pierce County, you've got the Steilacoom and Ketron Island and Anderson Island ferry. Up in the north, you have the Lummi Island ferry, and if you've never been on that, it's quite fun. You don't pay in line. You pay when you're on the boat. You get on the boat, you drive on, and the attendant comes around and just collects your money from you in your car or in person there. So that's pretty fun. Guaymas Island, an equally short little ferry ride. Don't get caught coming back on weekend traffic. It can be a little nutty. In King County, we've got the fast ferries out to Vashon and West Seattle, certainly ones that we're going to see more and more of, and now I think there's actually one out to Kingston. And then there are 3 private ferries in the Sound, and these are ferries operated by homeowners associations. And I thought, well, you know, maybe they'll let me on, I'll ask. So the Decatur Island ferry, they would not even allow me on the boat. The Gedney Hat Island ferry, they allowed me on the boat, but they wouldn't allow me off the boat. I couldn't get onto Hat Island, but to their credit, it was the only ferry boat where the people sang happy birthday to the captain. Finally, the Heron Island ferry, they let me on the boat, they let me on the island, they let me back on the boat. It was also the place where I had my favorite little encounter with different types of ways of transporting yourself. While I was in the parking lot waiting for the ferry boat to show up, this big truck pulls up and the guy gets out and he unloads 3 or 4 John Deere riding mowers, and the ferry comes in, people get off the ferry, walk over, get on their John Deere, drive it back onto the ferry, and then take it back. What they were going to do, how they were going to, maybe that's the way they drive around Heron Island. I don't know. I only got on the island. I didn't actually get to explore. And then finally, Jetty Island. This is the shortest route. It goes across to this little this little artificial island out there. But again, just a wonderful little spot up there. The highlight for me of all my ferry rides, though, was when I got to ride the Fauntleroy ferry with Captain Marcia Morse, who has worked for the WashDOT system for 40 some odd years, has ridden every route, has great opinions and thoughts on things. Oh, the Bremerton route, yeah, that used to be a lot tougher. Now it's, it's a bunch of tech people. It's not nearly as interesting, and sort of same thing with Vashon. But what I was really struck by her comment during our conversation was when she said, I grew up in Eastern Washington and this big open landscape, and I sort of had a spiritual connection to place. And she said, when I'm out on the ferry, when I'm out on the Sound, I have that same feel of that openness, of that being able to see the landscape in a way that you can't experience it on land very easily in the Sound with the forest. And she said, I think there is this spiritual aspect of the ferry boat ride. It gives people this way to connect with the landscape. And I think that that is a central part of the story that we have in Puget Sound, that we are incredibly lucky that we do have these ferries. We are a place that has a huge number of private boats, but probably, I would guess, most of us make our connection to the water through the ferry, through going out and seeing the landscape and seeing the animals. How many of us have seen orca and whales and dolphins and porpoises and sea lions out there and had this spiritual aspect? So I think the waterway, and what helps define Puget Sound, is that the waterway that we live in is both a working waterway and a very practical waterway, but it also is a spiritual waterway. And it really is defining of Puget Sound, this connection we have to the Sound through the boats, through its maritime history. Thank you. That's all I know right now.
Thank you so much, David. We've got lots of questions for you, so get ready.
Okay, may I just say one thing? Those of you, please send me emails or tweet, or I'm going to go to let you show you this little slide. So again, getting back to Mohai, that's what it's all about.
Thank you. Mohai appreciates the support. Okay, so while I'm posing questions, if you haven't asked a question yet, you are still welcome to. In the little Q&A box, you can go ahead and ask a question. So David, we had a couple of questions about the Blackball ferry system. One was who owned the Blackball line before it became state-owned, and what years was the Blackball ferry system operating?
Oh, good question. The Peabody family owned it, and Joshua Green in the Pacific, the Puget Sound Navigation Services, and they own it up until they sell it in 1950 to the state. And I can't remember. I think the earliest it goes back is to the early. I can't remember if it's the early 1900s or just at the end of the 19th century. I don't remember the exact dates. It'll be in the book though.
Great, good plug for the book. Okay, one more question about the mosquito fleet. Did the mosquito fleet have any interesting role in bootlegging during Prohibition?
You know, that was a question I tried to find an answer to, and I didn't find an explicit answer to it. By that point, it's sort of starting to fade out. But I do know that for instance, the Lake Union Dry Dock Company on Lake Union, that they built two types of vessels. They built vessels for rum runners, and then the rum runners had their boats, but then the Coast Guard, whoever it was who was chasing them, they also wanted boats from the same company, and they would build supposedly a little bit faster ones for them. So certainly it was going on, but I was not able to track down any specific boats that were specifically associated with bootlegging. It must have happened. It had to, because they were going everywhere. They were privately owned. They had character. I just can't imagine it didn't happen.
Yeah, that would be an interesting story. Another question about the mosquito fleet. Did you find any other waterways that had mosquito fleet type swarms of steamers?
I didn't, but then I didn't look terribly hard. I think there were certainly some up in north of the border, but I didn't really look terribly hard for that, just only so much research I could do.
Sure. You mentioned that the ferry exploded, and there was a question about whether anybody was injured or harmed.
Not that I know of. I think they just regularly just blew up. I think it was just a sort of a standard thing. They would be there, and maybe it overheated. There were the bigger, more famous accidents of mosquito fleet vessels were when they went aground somewhere. In particular, there's one up that was going north out of Port Townsend up to, or went by Port Townsend, was going over to Victoria area, and that one, I forget, but it was a huge number. So it was more, those were the ones where the bigger issues were crashing, less so than exploding.
Okay, we have a question that's clearly from a local. With the West Seattle High Bridge out of order for years, do you think there'll be more walk-on ferries from downtown Seattle to points in West Seattle?
It seems like there should. I mean, if you think about it's a logical way to go. There used to be a ferry that went to Carroll Street, which is now Weather Watch Park on the other side of Bainbridge, or excuse me, of West Seattle. So I mean, it's a logical way to go. And if you were smart, you could. Why they can't have smaller vessels plying the waterway? I mean, it make it sort of fun. So yeah.
Yeah, seems like a great idea.
Yeah.
Was every private ferry considered part of the mosquito fleet? This questioner also mentioned that their grandparents would take the Concordia to Fox Island in the 30s. Was that part of the fleet?
I don't know specifically with the Concordia, just because there's so many. But from what I gathered in when I was talking to Joe Barr, his list, he was basically just going through and coming up with lists of them. Vessels. My guess is the majority of them were considered part of the mosquito fleet if they were a small steamer that was used for transporting people or goods. Somehow, I'm guessing it got included. And again, there was no official designation. There was nothing official about it. It was really how things just got defined. So I'm guessing probably most of them were, but I would assume that there were many that we know nothing about.
Thank you. A couple more questions coming in about the Black Ball ferry line. One person is asking, can you talk about the Coho ferry a bit and its history relative to the Black Ball ferry line? And another person wants to know if the Black Ball ferry continued from Port Angeles to Victoria.
I cannot speak of the Coho. I don't really know a lot about the specifics of individual ferries in it. The Black Ball that exists right now was an outgrowth of the original Black Ball ferry line, and it sort of splintered off, and there was one small section that remains, and it's basically kept the name, even though it wasn't really part of the as fully embraced in the big main Black Ball line that was the Peabody Joshua Green line. I think it was sort of subsidiary of it, but there is a sort of a connection, but more of a thin thread than a fat thread.
Thanks. Here's a question that's going back to the beginning of your talk, where you were talking about war canoes. The question says that term war canoes implies that there was conflict between Native people in the Puget Sound area. Was there in fact conflict, and if so, what do you know about that?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. That conflict, in fact, one of the chapters of the book looks at warfare in Puget Sound and traces it over thousands of years, what archaeological evidence, and there certainly was a lot of warfare. It was both within the Sound and from outside the Sound. It was in particular coming from the northern groups that we would now consider First Nations groups, and some tribes up all the way further north, Simeon, up that way. And what really changes or drives part of it later in the story, and I address this a little bit, is the idea of slavery, which was certainly occurred down here and occurred up in the north. And it was in no way comparable to what we think of as slavery in the South. This was, when I've talked to tribal members down here, they compared it more to indentured servitude. It wasn't good, but it wasn't like it was in the South. But what happens is people become sort of a commodity in some sense, and are basically taken during warfare. So warfare becomes fairly important, and what I write about is looking at the forts and the different types of defense mechanisms that were built in this area. And a lot of this research is fairly recent in the sense that people have done a lot of work on warfare, up further north, where the environment led to a different development of how people related to landscape. And part of what I've heard it described as is that further north, where you had coastal conditions that could lead to years or time periods where food was harder to get, that could lead toward warfare. And down here, where food was more plentiful and more guaranteed, if you will, you had less of it down here, but it was still, there was a connection between the north and the south, and then also within Puget Sound, there were issues between different groups. And I wouldn't use the word tribe, because the word tribe does not really come into play into Puget Sound until after 1855, 56, and the signing of the treaties. There were no tribes prior to that. The people were organized in a different way than what we think of as a tribe, as I understand it. And again, I do not speak at all for tribal people in this area. These are the stories that I've heard and tried to share and tell, hopefully with respect.
Thank you. That actually ties into one of the earlier questions we got. Wondering if you could explain some of the differences between the Puget Sound and the Salish Sea on the Canadian side.
Probably the biggest difference is people. There's just so many more, if you're asking from that point of view. I mean, the classic example that is talked about is the difference between the northern resident and the southern resident killer whales or orcas, that our population, as we all know, is in dire situation, the southern residents, and the northern resident population is doing much better, in part because there's more salmon and there are fewer people and fewer pollutants up there, is one of the reasons. So that's one of the central differences, I think, between the two. I mean, ecosystem-wise, they're pretty similar. They're, from a human point of view, both north and south of the border would have been Coast Salish people, and obviously the border is an artificial creation since 1846, it's a very new idea. So I think those would be some of the main differences.
Great, thank you. We have a question here. How many of these ships do you think are underwater in the Sound? And has anybody tried to make a map of that?
42. I have no idea. Probably, if you look at, they've done a lot of work in Lake Union, as you probably are well aware, Nicole. A lot of vessels are there, probably quite a few in the bottom in Puget Sound. I mean, you have this huge waterway that's so deep, we have so little information. I think it'd be interesting to know how many are down there, or try and put together, go through and look at stories in newspapers and different publications about when they sank and what happened to them. But as far as I know, no one has ever put that story together.
All right, so there's an opportunity for somebody.
PhD.
What can you tell us about boat building in the Sound?
They did it. Again, that it wasn't necessarily a subject I looked into much. I know that it was done, and particularly Lake Union obviously became a very big area once after the opening of the ship canal. It was a central area for it. And it did occur throughout the Sound, but it was not a central feature of my research. So I don't want to speak without any knowledge.
That seems smart. However, based on the knowledge you've presented, we have quite a few people who are interested in your book that's coming out. So related to that, people want to know when it's coming, how they can get it, and until it comes out, what's the best way to keep up with your research?
Excellent. How exciting is that? Excellent question. Thanks, Mom. It is, at present, the hope is that it will be out in spring of 2021, so about a year from now, called Home Waters, Human and Natural History in Puget Sound. And really the two best ways, I'm going to go back one slide if I may. One is through my website, geologywriter.com. I have a books or a walks and talks page that sort of keeps up to date on things. And then really primarily through my Twitter account, I've been posting information on that. If you go to the Encyclopedia of Puget Sound or History Link, I've written a couple articles for them that grew out of that. And I can certainly go and create, maybe I'll do that tomorrow. I can create a blog posting tomorrow on my Geology Writer site that has links to all the articles that I have done that tie into it. So I'm slowly doing stuff, but at this point we're getting to the phase of heading into developing the book, looking for images, maps, and that's sort of a really fun phase for me right now, to think of what is it going to look like in the future, and this book. And we're definitely going to have images, we're definitely having custom made maps, because there's so many places. And as you know, going back to that 350 stops in Puget Sound, or the greater Puget Sound area for the mosquito fleet, there's so many place names that have disappeared over time, or really lost that connection that we have. So I really want to ensure in the book that we have maps to understand where things are, what's going on in the story. But at this point, hopefully 2021, University of Washington Press.
Great, thank you so much. Well, that's the last question for the evening. So let's give David a big virtual round of applause. You can add that to chat. And I just want to thank you for being our first virtual History Cafe speaker, David. We really appreciate you. And everyone who came and listened, thank you so much for joining us. We hope you enjoyed the program. If you learned anything new, or you enjoy the work of our museum, we would really appreciate your support. You can join us as a member, you can sign up for our newsletter, or you can make a donation on our website, or as part of the Give Big campaign. That means that part of your contribution will be matched. And you can find out more at mohai.org. And our donor page will actually open up after this webinar is over. So we hope that you loved it so much that you'll come back next month on May 20th for our next Virtual History Cafe. And until then, we just hope that you all stay safe, stay healthy, take care of each other. And thank you for being part of our community tonight.
Thank you all for participating. Stay safe.
Good night.